Part 1, Principles of Systemic Change. What we are looking at in Part 1 is different types of change, the co-production, the interaction of co-producing factors, also the interaction of conceptual and physical reality, and the 7 forces of change. We have already talked about these concepts in previous modules. We are looking at them now in the context of change. Then we are looking at the flow of change within a system and between systems, namely the flow in space and the flow of change in time. We look then at how systems change, namely that they grow and develop, that there is a difference between what we mean by growth and what we mean by development, and goes through stages of growth and development, that there are limits to growth and that we can transform a system by developing it. We have learned in Module 1 and Module 2 that change is co-produced by cofactors from the outer environment and how the system taps them or reacts to them, by cofactors from the inner environment and how the system taps them and reacts to them, and also by cofactors from the system itself. So change management must always span these 3 levels. We cannot work with a system at its own level only. We have to take external and internal stakeholders into consideration, as well as the self. When we refer to the self, we mean the level of focus of our intervention. Are we working with an organizational self, the self of the organization? Then external stakeholders would be outside of the organization, and the inner stakeholders would be the various functions and their inner stakeholders. Or is our level of focus, the self, the department? Then the organization would be external as well as the cofactors from outside the organization, and the members of the function would be the internal stakeholders. Or are we working with an individual change, for example in a career planning situation? Then the department and the organization would be external, and so on. So as a change manager, it is very important that we are clear what is the focus, the level of focus of our intervention, and not mix it up with other levels. We also learned previously that cofactors interact with each other. We have worked with that in the context of a systems dynamics model. So cofactors impact on each other, and as a result of that, change continuously ripples through the system. The external cofactors, internal cofactors, cofactors of the self of the system interact, impact on each other, they tap each other, and change is ongoing, change is. And this is expressed beautifully by Heraclit's famous quote, "You cannot step twice into the same river." The reason is that the water has flown on, new water has come in, and even the person stepping in the river the second time is not the same as they were before. From a change management perspective, this is a very important insight, because the change manager will deal in praxis with those continuously shifting change situations. One cannot pin down a system and keep it like that. By the time we look at it, it is already something different. Every contribution of every stakeholder shifts the whole picture. And the change manager has the challenge to learn and flow with that, and not try to stem the flow and maybe dam it. We've also learned that every system has a conceptual and a physical reality. We use the example of the plan and the house to illustrate that. The plan of the house shows the house in conceptual reality. It is real, it is the real house, but in conceptual reality. It is not yet manifested in physical reality. It is not yet implemented as a plan. So the house of brick and mortar is the real thing in physical reality. And we have learned that physical reality unfolds according to conceptual reality. So the house will be built according to the plan. If there's a problem in the plan, a calculation error, for example, then we build a wrong house and maybe it will collapse. What is the task of the change manager? On the one hand, they will analyze the current situation, what is wrong with the house now, with the organization now, and what do we understand about the current conceptual reality, what are our beliefs and values in the current conceptual reality. We will work with the current ethos, and they will have to change the conceptual reality. They will have to facilitate a change in the conceptual reality with respect to making a more ideal design of what we would like the physical reality to be. And they will need to align the two. So on the one hand, they will need to facilitate the redesign of conceptual reality. They will need to facilitate the implementation of that into physical reality. And they will also need to manage the iterations of evaluating what is happening in physical reality, and are we really succeeding in implementing conceptual reality, and if not, do we have to change the conceptual reality? Do we have to replan, or do we have to amend the way we implement? So aligning the two realities is also an important part of change management. Also, the change manager must be aware that conceptual and physical reality differ. That the plan is not the house of brick and mortar, it is an abstraction of that. And our strategic plan, our ideal design, our implementation plan is not how the organization actually will function or how our business units will function in a physical reality. They have a translation function. Not every representative of a stakeholder, every person is able to take the plan of a house, in other words, an abstract plan, and see the relevance of that for their own physical reality. So to create the buy-in, the change manager will have to translate how the conceptual reality will look in the physical reality of that particular person. So this is a very important task during the implementation phase. We have previously learned about the 7 forces of organization. The whole module 3 was the detailed exploration of each of those forces of organization. And as the word force indicates, those forces of organization are actually forces of change. As we work with changing one of those forces, we are changing the system. What we maybe have not highlighted sufficiently yet is that some of those forces exist in physical reality. We indicated that with the color gray, like in the previous slide. So substance of a system and the environment reside in physical reality, while the ethos, aims, governance, process, structure reside in conceptual reality. So my value of beauty is information in the conceptual reality, and it will inform my substance, the way I design my house or the dress I'm buying. It will inform the choice, the physical reality. But in itself, as an ethos, as a value, it is abstract in conceptual reality. Likewise, the aims I have in life are abstract, but the way the system unfolds is concrete and real. Same with process. If I take the analogy of water, the flow of water is process. This is an abstract thing. The water is the water. If it flows, I call it a process. If it is stagnant, I call it a structure. The water is the same. And also the way I'm regulating the water through the riverbed. Sometimes it is steeper and the flow is faster or less stagnant. So the governance per se is an abstract thing. The water is the water. It is how the substance is behaving in praxis that is informed by conceptual reality. So what the change manager does is the change manager works with those abstract forces, helps to shape or facilitates the design of the ethos, aims, process, structure, governance, and helps then to implement that the substance, the people of the organization, the production flow, the flow of data, and so on, is according to those organizing forces. We look now at the flow of change from a spatial perspective. We explore two types of change within a system, the clockwise and counterclockwise force of change, and then how the change flows through the system's hierarchy. When we look at the 7 forces of organization, and when we change one of the 7 forces, there will be an impact created on some of the other forces. And that impact takes 2 forms. Either it inspires a change in the other force also, or it arouses a resistance to the change. This twofold impact gives rise to 2 types of directions of change, the clockwise and the counterclockwise. Let us start with the counterclockwise change. If we have an existing governance in the system, then existing structures are being reinforced. And if we have existing structures, process is channeled within the structure. So the current process is perpetuated, which reinforces current aims and current ethos. And the substance of the system represents that, functions according to that. So this is the entrenched potential direction of change. If we want to introduce different changes and start with introducing a change in ethos, there will be automatically the desire to change the aims according to the new ethos. If new aims are introduced into the system, new processes to help achieve those aims are being inspired, and new structures and governance that help achieve those aims are being created. So this is the clockwise direction of change, and the substance, the MEI of the existing system, will have to change. It will have to follow new processes, be configured in new structures, and have new governance. So the clockwise change is an active change, and it is intended change. For example, intended change through ideal system redesign. And these 2 forces are potentially always operative in a system. The actual change that happens once I introduce a new change intentionally is a mix between the 2 changes. I may have the intention to change the system in one way, but the resistance to it takes its own form, and we have, first of all, turbulence. So as the 2 forces of change hit each other, there will be turbulence created, or eddies of change that occur. And the emergence that occurs as a result of that turbulence, which leads to the actual change, is unpredictable. even if we try to bring orderly change into the system, because of the current configuration in the counterclockwise resistance, there is an emergence that is unpredictable. For the change manager, this implies that there is no change that can be made which does not arouse turbulence. And the second lesson is that however well intended our change is, the actual change will be different than the one that we intend. If you're looking at the two types of change in a different way, from the perspective of physical and conceptual reality, then we can see that the counterclockwise change is entrenched in the current conceptual reality of the system, and it manifests practically in the way the system is organized and functions currently. So the resistance is that of passive resistance. It just perpetuates existing functioning, and it only becomes a force of change if a new intended change is brought into the system. Then the counterclockwise change becomes a very active force of resistance. So if I want to bring fundamental change into a system, we need to redesign conceptual reality through an ideal design, the ideal ethos, aims, process, structure, and governance of how the new system should function. And we need to introduce that change in a clockwise manner into the current system, which of course will give rise to its counterclockwise resistance. So each type of change is entrenched or resides in a different reality. If we now introduce the environment into this equation, then the clockwise and counterclockwise change of the system we looked at is going to flow into the environment and from the environment. It flows across levels in the system's hierarchy. For example, if we intentionally introduce change at the level of society, for argument's sake, we change the regulation of our industry in which our organization resides, then this intentional change at the societal level will need to flow as intentional change into the organization. The organization will have to comply and also actively change the way it functions according to that new legislation. This will imply that every individual in that organization that is affected by that particular legislation will need to also actively change. They will need to change their ethos, their aims, process, governance, structure according to that new change. Obviously, between the organizational level and the individual level, in praxis there will be sub-levels such as the departmental level, maybe a sub-departmental level, a team level, and so on. But the same principles apply at those levels. As the intended change is being introduced at each level, derived from the external level, they will need to change the ethos, aims, process, structure, governance accordingly. And what will happen at each level, as the new change is introduced at that level, the counterclockwise force of change will be aroused. There will be resistance to that new change. And that happens at each level. And that resistance can also transfer itself from one level to another. As individuals are disgruntled with having to change according to the new legislation, they will create disorder and discontent in the organization, which may also express its discontent and disapproval and disagreement with the new legislation at the societal level. So as the clockwise intended change flows from the societal to the individual level, the counterclockwise resistance will flow back up the system's hierarchy. If we're looking at this a little more closely, every system has a number of containing subsystems. So within an organization, we have a large number of individuals. So as we are introducing that new legislative change at the organizational level, it will imply that every individual will have to adjust its own functioning according to that new legislation. This is a vortex of change that is being created between two levels. The intended change is intended to create more order in the system. There's one coherent change that will be in an orderly fashion introduced into the particular parts of the organization, and they will be reinterpreted there as is appropriate. But at the same time as this change is being introduced, each part of the system has its resistance aroused, and each of these resistances takes its own form of resistance and communicates itself upward, almost as a wheel of different types of disagreement or resistance, which will create its own disorder. So the vortex of resistance to change that comes from bottom up against the introduced top-down change will create even more turbulence than the turbulence of those two forces of change are within one system. And this is a huge challenge to the change manager, and this is one of the main reasons why, as change is designed at one level, the stakeholders of the inner level as well as outer level need to participate in the change at that level, so that already there is buy-in, agreement, and the lessening of the resistance created. We are looking now at the flow of change from the time perspective. Again, we look at the two types of change. We call them now momentum versus intent. And we are looking at the flow of change through the system's hierarchy from a temporal perspective. We have previously talked about the current and the ideal future, and that the current situation has momentum that drives it into the current future. This momentum is actually the counterclockwise change. The way the current situation, the current ethos, aims, process, structure, and governance of the system is configured drives the system into its current futures. So this force of change represents the momentum. The ideal future is deliberately designed, and we have heard that we need to backcast from the ideal future into the current future to change the functioning of the current system. In other words, to change the ethos, aims, process, structure, governance that we designed in the ideal future. We need to entrench that in the current situation. So this is the force of intent. We do that through deliberate intent, and we are introducing the design in a clockwise fashion. In the current situation, the two forces of change, the clockwise and counterclockwise change, meet. And as we had said previously, the transformation is complete when the momentum, in other words, the counterclockwise force of the current future, reinforces the clockwise force of the intent associated with the ideal future. If we look at the flow of change across levels, then, as we outlined previously, the clockwise and counterclockwise forces flow through the system's hierarchy. So if we are, for example, making a design at the organizational level, an ideal design, we need to cascade that into sub-designs at all departmental levels, sub-departmental levels, individual levels of individual functions. This is the spatial cascading, and from each level the ideal sub-design is backcast to the current situation, where the interaction of the current and ideal future hopefully will reinforce in such a way that the ideal future of the organization as a whole is happening. So from the perspective of a change manager, the implications are that the change manager needs to facilitate the ideal design, that it is cascaded into sub-designs at all levels in the organization. This is done through spatial cascading. In other words, once a design has been made, it needs to be cascaded, and then at each level these sub-designs needs to be backcast through strategic planning, long-term, medium-term, short-term, into the current situation to change the current functioning of the system so that the system functions according to the ideal situation. And this is involving temporal cascading. So the change manager must facilitate both spatial cascading first, and then must ensure that at each level the ideal is actually entrenched through temporal cascading. The following are some of the most important principles of change management. The first is that all change starts with a change in conceptual reality, or put differently, all change starts with rethinking. The more fundamentally we rethink the change, the more the system will in the end change. Whatever we haven't thought beforehand, we cannot bring about. Another important principle is that the current situation perpetuates the status quo. That is what we refer to as momentum. And as a result, it resists any intended change. This is inevitable. Never mind how well managed a change intervention is, it is always leading to resistance. There is no change without turbulence. And as we have learned, the turbulence becomes less and then ceases as soon as the intended change has become entrenched in the system and has become the current reality of the system, the momentum of the system. Another important change principle is that in the short term, systems seem unable to change, while in the long term, they change radically. If we are looking at our economy or our organization or family or any other system now and compare it to what it was 15 or 10 years ago, we will see how radically different it is now to what it was at that time. Yet if we were now propose to the system equally fundamental change for the next 15 years, the system will resist and say it is not possible. To make sure that in the long term the change that is inevitable is desirable, the system needs an ideal design which guides its long-term change. If it doesn't have such an ideal, the system will still change radically, but in a different way. It will be impacted on by external forces to which it has responded, and it will move into a radically different future than it would have been if the change would have been guided by a long-term ideal. We look now at growth and development of systems. First, we are looking at the difference between the concept of growth and the concept of development. Then we look at stages of change, stages of growth and development. We discuss limits to growth, how to transform limits to growth through development. And then we discuss the role of S-curves and how to manage the S-curves of growth and development. and we also look at the temporal perspective of growth and development. There is a difference between growth and development. Change can lead to growth or development. There's a difference between those two concepts, and that was outlined by Eckhoff, the famous system thinker. He defined growth as an increase in size and number. Typically, our measures in business have to do with growth. We measure the size of the market share, the increase in profit, the increase in output, and so on. However, this is not necessarily development. Development, according to Eckhoff, is a qualitative change. It implies increasing the ability of the system to do more with what it has and to give more qualitative value, not necessarily in terms of quantity. He emphasized that one can grow without development. For example, I can give the same standardized product to more and more customers. This is growth, but this is not development of the business. On the other hand, I can develop my business, I can have the same number of customers, but I am giving new types of products, I develop my service. This is development and not growth. What are the implications for the change manager? A change manager, first of all, needs to create the awareness between the two, which is not always obvious. And personally, I believe they should emphasize development rather than growth. And they need to make their clients aware that from a systemic point of view, development is multidimensional. One can add economic value, political value, cultural value, technological value, ecological value, physiological value, etc. So the development is multidimensional. Value can be added to what one does in all those dimensions. One can sum up the debate between growth and development as follows. The current global economy is driven by a more and more growth ethic. This is responsible for practically all of humanity's problems, ranging from climate change and poverty to the finance crisis. To achieve a more sustainable way of life and to create sustainable organizations will require a multidimensional development ethic. As systems change, they go through identifiable stages of change. Typically, we call them stages of growth and development. For example, we can observe that a person goes through a prenatal, early childhood, teenage, young, mature, adult, and old age stage. The naming of those stages depends on the kind of characteristic one looks at, and one can identify more or less stages, and they are typically related to the characteristics one is looking for. In societal development, we conventionally talk about the hunting and gathering stage, the agrarian stage, industrial stage, and now we live in the information stage of societal development. In business development, we conventionally distinguish between the inception of the business, a growth stage, and a maturing and aging stage. Sometimes the term stage is also replaced with the term phase. So we talk about an inception, growth, maturing, aging phase. The implications for the change manager are that a system needs different change interventions during different stages of its development. One doesn't treat a toddler in the same way as a teenager. Likewise, if a business is in an early growth phase, there will be different strategies necessary than during a mature phase of the business. So important is that if a change manager facilitates an intervention, that the stage of development of the system they want to change is diagnosed and stage appropriate strategies are developed. Typically, the stage in which the system is in is identified during the diagnosis phase. There are limits to growth, but not necessarily limits to development. Growth is limited by the environment, by limited resources, and that can be the outer or the inner environment. We cannot use, as humanity, more resources than the planet has available for us. And many of the crises we have now globally have to do with limited resources. Not enough fresh water, not enough energy reserves, etc., etc. It can also be the inner environment, the resources of the inner environment that limit growth. For example, an organization may not be able to take on additional projects because it does not have enough manpower to handle it. So this is limits to growth from within the system, the inner environment. Typically, a limit is referred to as a carrying capacity, and we have previously shown the figure of carrying capacity, namely that as a system grows, it will hit a limit, a carrying capacity. If the growth of the system overshoots the carrying capacity and moves past the tipping point, the system will collapse. We have shown this figure previously, and we have given the example of the cattle on a piece of grazing land. If we put more cattle than the carrying capacity, for example, if the carrying capacity is 60 cattle and we put 70 cattle for grazing, we will overgraze. All the grass will be eaten up, a tipping point is reached, and the system will collapse. We will have a desert, not a meadow. The implications for the change manager are that they need to create awareness about limits, overshoot and tipping point. In an organizational context, some of the overshoot or tipping points can be the burnout of staff, for example. It is important for the change manager to facilitate the identification of limits, and this is typically done during the problem analysis phase. Often before a system approaches its limits, one can already identify crises. We see that clearly in the climate change debate now. We realize that all sorts of areas within the ecology seem to be in crisis. So we know that we are approaching some limits. If the system wants to continue to grow beyond the limits, it needs to resolve the crisis through going into another stage of development. If we want to carry on as humanity growing economically, then we need to develop our economies differently in terms of energy use, that we are finding ways of not using so many greenhouse gases and stay within acceptable limits, for example. The same is true for social systems. We have illustrated this previously with this graph, and we have used the example of agriculture and different stages of agriculture to illustrate the point, namely that if we want to increase the yield of subsistence farming, we have to transform into industrial farming, and if that reaches its limits, we have to go into information age farming, for example. If we look at the food production activity system as a case study, we can identify various stages of agricultural development in the history of humanity, and in fact all those stages are still operative in parts of the world. There is a hunting, gathering, subsistence agriculture, industrial agriculture, information and green agriculture stage. Each of those stages has its own challenges leading to its own crisis, forcing a transformation to the next stage. Typically in the hunting-gathering stage is a growing population leading to more and more competition for limited resources. Overgathering occurs with the result of not enough food, forcing the population into subsistence farming. Again, as the population keeps growing, overgrazing occurs, soil erosion is typical for that phase, and not enough yields. A transition to industrial agriculture allows a much greater production of food, but eventually there are challenges of toxicity, over-fertilization, and also competition between smaller farming units and the mega agribusinesses. Information agriculture could hit a crisis as a result of health and environmental threats of genetically modified foods, and green agriculture begs the question if organic production will produce enough food or if there would be shortages. The limits to the further growth and development of a system can be multidimensional. We have discussed the physical limits of the containing system associated with the carrying capacity, for example, the limited amount of natural resources available. There can, however, also be cultural or information limits, that the solutions exist for a system to develop to a next stage, but it hasn't got enough information to help it to make the transition, or it has different values that make a particular solution culturally unacceptable. There can be political limits, for example, new laws limiting a particular solution to development, or there can be organizational limits that the system is unable to organize itself to make the transition, or the political system that we have in societies can limit further development. For example, long-term infrastructural development is often hampered by the 4 or 5 year legislative periods that a particular government has available to make decisions. There can also be technological limits. For example, technological development made certain products or production processes obsolete, or technological development has not caught up yet with the challenge that the system faces. There can be economic limits, that products or production is not cost effective vis-à-vis a competing model, for example, or that solutions exist but they are not cost efficient. Not only the limits to development are multidimensional, but the transformation of a system to a new stage of development is also multidimensional. For example, physical limits can be transformed by new stages of technological or organizational development. Or economic limits can be transformed by cultural or technological developments. Cultural developments could be a rebranding or the adoption of new values or learning new information. Technological developments could be product or production innovation. Political limits, like for example a new regulation, can be transformed by further technological development or economic or cultural development. In short, all combinations of dimensions are possible to transform the system into a new stage of development. Some of the implications for the change manager are that the following questions need to be answered. Is your project challenged by a limit? Do you understand the limit? Is your system approaching a crisis? Do you understand the crisis? Do you know which development can transform the system? And you need to consider multidimensional development to make this transformation. There's an empirical study done on organizational stages of development which show the same pattern of a system growing or the organization growing, hitting a crisis, resolving that crisis, going into a next transformation stage until a new crisis is reached, and so on. This study was done by Greiner, and he identified the following stages and crises. First, an organization goes through a creativity stage as it is founded. The founding fathers and mothers are doing most of the work themselves. They develop the business, and as the business starts growing, a leadership crisis is looming. And many organizations do not grow beyond the phase. The entrepreneurs, if they do not want to let go of control, they will not be able to handle the amount of business anymore. So what needs to happen is the business needs to go into a direction stage. The various functions of the growing organization need to be taken over by function-specific business units and functional units run by function-specific and business unit-specific managers. This stage allows the business to carry on growing for a while until an autonomy crisis is reached. Some business units may say what the center tells us is not appropriate for our clients or for our stage of development. And if the business wants to carry on growing, it needs to go into a delegation stage. It needs to allow more freedom to its business unit and functional unit managers to develop their own work and to carry on growing. This in turn leads to a control crisis. Suddenly there are too many business units who run their own show and the whole doesn't hang together anymore. And this crisis needs to be resolved by a coordination stage. Many large businesses are in that situation now where their various business units are doing their own thing and the whole organization is suffering. If they introduce wrong controls, which need to be introduced, it could lead to a red tape crisis, that we are stifling the autonomy. This typically is resolved through, as you observed, a collaboration stage. Suddenly business units, functional units are formally or informally starting to work together. There are lots of meetings, lots of stakeholder activities, and that can lead to a saturation crisis. Greiner predicts that it will lead to a saturation crisis because staff is overworked. They have to do so much collaboration now before they can actually do their work. From a systems point of view, what we observe through these different stages is that they represent a butterflying, as we call it, between the integration and differentiation. We have previously shown and discussed paradox, namely integration and differentiation, that the system is one, is integrated, and that the system consists of many, is differentiated. And if we are plotting the phases of organization development on this graph, we can see that the creativity stage is differentiation. It is flexible, one adjusts easily to different conditions in the market, and that this is followed by the direction stage, which is an integrative stage, a centralizing stage. And the crisis that is hit there leads to a delegation stage. This is again a butterflying back to differentiation, to flexibility, And the crisis induced in this stage leads to a coordination stage, which again is an integrative stage. And the crisis, the red tape crisis observed there, leads to a collaboration stage. What we learn in system thinking is that we should exactly avoid the butterflying between the two sides of a paradox, and that system thinking advocates that one should follow a path of optimal development, which is balancing act between integration and differentiation. One should not replace one integrative and differentiating phase with another, but one should always have both integration and differentiation available as the system moves into the future. And we achieve that through creating a systemic learning organization. The implications for the change manager are the following. One can set up or one can transform an organization into a systemic learning organization during or after any stage. We could set up at the outset of the business that the business is a systemic learning organization and has integrating and differentiating tendencies set up, and as the business grows they change their shape, but they are not butterflying from the one to the other. There's always integration and differentiation. So by setting up a learning organization, we can move along the path of optimal development and avoid butterflying. The growth and development of a system typically follows an S-curve. So what the S-curve shows is that an inception stage is typically followed by a growth stage, which slows down and becomes more mature and aging. And eventually in natural systems we have a death of the system following the aging stage. In social systems, we do not need to have the death or decline of a system, but the system can transform itself. As we said earlier, it transforms itself as a crisis approaches. However, we can also transform before a crisis occurs, and what is typically advocated in business development or in product development is to start transformation as the system enters the maturity phase. If the system starts transformation during that phase, it can avoid a crisis. So inception of the next stage of development, of the next product development or the next business development should occur during the maturity stage. The implications for the change manager are that they must identify what stage of development the system is in with which they work, and then facilitate, first of all, stage appropriate strategies, as we have said earlier. And if the system is identified to be in the early maturity stage, they should facilitate an ideal redesign to allow that the system transforms itself timelessly. We're looking now at the temporal perspective of development. The speed of development of a system depends on how rapidly the environment changes. This is illustrated by this figure. The first steep curves illustrate an organization, for example, that transforms rapidly in very short time, maybe every 2-3 years. An example of that would be the IT industry, because the IT industry changes so rapidly. An IT organization has to transform itself every couple of years. There may be businesses that grow slower, and some that grow very much slower. They take a long time to transform themselves. Some of the resource industries, maybe the oil industry or the coal industry, have longer times to transform themselves. Also, the investment is valid for much longer periods of time. What is the implications for the change manager? Well, firstly, they need to be aware how rapidly the environment changes, or they need to facilitate that awareness of how rapidly the environment changes. And they need to facilitate the creation of an ideal design that accommodates that rapidity of change. Ideally, a system should not grow faster than its environment or slower than its environment. If it grows faster than its environment, it may be ahead of its time and may not reap the benefits of slower growth and maturing phase. Some of the very innovative organizations fall into that trap. They cannot really reap the economic benefits because they're so far ahead of the time, and then those who copy them will actually reap the economic benefits. If a system grows slower than the environment, it will become obsolete and probably die or be taken over if it is an organization.